Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we speak with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Colin Jones, who is the CTO at Eighth Light, a software consultancy based out of Chicago, Illinois, in the U.S. Colin Jones, welcome to Maintainable.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Robby. Thanks for having me on.
So as someone who also works at a software consultancy, I'd like to focus our conversation on that, in particular, within the kind of the scope of client services. So first off, how would you describe technical debt to a client that doesn't have a strong background in software technology?
Yeah, good question. So technical debt is a very provocative term, and I think people use it in a lot of different ways. Some people use it to mean we made a mess and now we need to go fix the mess. Some people use it to mean we've made a decision to not do the best solution to this one particular piece of a system, and we are making a conscious decision that we're going to delay the payment for that decision that we know is poor but cheaper, and we're going to pay that down later, or maybe not at all if we get to throw that out. I kind of like the second definition better because it feels more in line with the sort of financial aspects of it and where the term came from initially. But I think so often we hear technical debt is just like I've got a mess that's slowing me down and I'm really unhappy with it because I didn't care enough initially. So often we use that term to describe just bad decisions that we just weren't thinking about like systematically when we made them.
Do you feel like is that more of like in retrospect, it seems like a bad decision based off of what we know now? Or do you find that it's more often a bad decision and then we could have made a better decision at the time given what we knew? Or is it more of a...
I think I've definitely seen both cases, right? I've seen cases where somebody writes a mess, and by mess, I might mean like a ton of functionality just wrapped up in one file, a bunch of nested conditionals, weird names that nobody can understand after the fact. And I think for a lot of those things, if we looked at it up front, we could all agree it was a bad decision, and probably we just weren't even thinking about whether it was good or bad. We were just thinking about getting the work done. And then in retrospect, whoever the next developer is might term it a bad decision or make that judgment. I like to think about technical debt in terms of we've made sort of a conscious decision about what kind of a decision we're making.
Maybe delaying that. We could do it X, Y, or Z. We're going to choose this way because it's quicker and to help a project get to market quicker so they can test out an idea. But maybe we know that if it works, we're going to have to come back and do some work later on to tidy that up or revisit it entirely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm totally down with that kind of mindset for something. I think the thing that I'm not down with is the mindset of we're going to make code that nobody can read in defense because we're going to market faster. But like, I think it's easy for the sort of messy situations to slow us down even in going to market really fast. There's of course like lots of gray area there where what defines a mess could be so terrible that nobody could read it, or it could be just slightly not the way I would do it.
Have you noticed there's any patterns that contribute to software collecting, say, too much technical debt outside of maybe quick to market type scenarios?
I like to see teams taking some portion of their planning process. A lot of our teams working sort of like an iterative process, whether it's like got some agile flavor to it or just pulling stories and working through them, but some sort of planning process, and there's some ordering to the work that gets done. And I think for those projects that I have observed having maybe too much technical debt too fast, or maybe not, it's hard for me to even use the term technical debt, too much of a mess. I think those situations I've seen happening more often when there's like absolutely no developer technical input and it's completely product driven. I've also seen like product leaders who are great at sort of balancing those concerns and planning a little bit for the long term, and maybe 10% of whatever the time a developer spends in a week or whatever is addressing some ongoing issues, like whether it's setting up some logging infrastructure or some pulling a service out or whatever. I think having some developer say into the work that they're knocking out is important. And I don't necessarily mean that it has to be like parsed out as like a big project or a story in the iteration. Like maybe it's just part of what you do day to day, but I think making that visible to like product managers and project managers and higher ups and folks like that, I think is kind of powerful because it can show, what it costs. And if that cost is just built into whatever the story is that you're working on, and that week over week, the stories just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, rather than having to visualize or being able to visualize what the debt is costing, then I think it's a lot harder to make the case that a bigger thing needs to be addressed. Without
knowing all the ins and outs of like your team's process, but let's say since you were mentioning story points and maybe some sort of agile flavor there, but like if your product manager has like a story that you want to work on, when it gets over to your developers, or maybe you're going through some story pointing process or some sort of estimating process, do you think it's the responsibility of the product manager or the developer to account for things that could contribute to technical debt, and or things like writing tests or any of the other documentation, or those things that you feel like a developer should be accounting for themselves? Or is that something you feel like a product manager should be like adding to like their checklist of things to consider?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've never been in sort of my job as project manager or product manager. I've done that sort of like ad hoc as part of things. I like to think about it being the whole team's responsibility. So like, yeah, ideally everybody's got this on their minds. And I guess I should also roll back and say like our process as a team, it depends on the client a lot. Like a lot of times we go in and work alongside our clients in whatever system they're working in. So I'll coach our developers and our other folks here will coach developers to raise these questions and work through these issues and lobby for the work that needs to be done. Things like writing tests. I mean, that's, as a consultancy, like that's part of the conversations we have initially. We don't go into clients really that are going to say you can't write tests. So we consider that kind of part of the deal, part of our job.
You don't have to ask for permission to write tests.
Yeah, or like refactor, like you go into a piece of code that's messy, you need to add a feature, and hopefully, when you're done with your PR or your commit or whatever, then it looks better than when you came in there, and not worse, hopefully. There's outliers, right? Like you find a bug in production and you need to ship it now. Sure, you can add another case to the 20-line if statement or something like that, right?
Since we're talking a little bit about the type of work that your company does, maybe to take a quick step back, what types of projects does 8th Light specialize in?
We're historically not really a company of specialties. We started as mostly a Ruby shop, but we did some Java, some C++ early on. This was way back in the day, like 10 years ago. These days, we're doing a pretty wide mix. There's a lot of web backend stuff, a lot of large companies doing microservice kinds of things, stacks all over the map, Ruby, Java, .NET, Elixir, Clojure, Node, lots of front-end JavaScript stuff. I'm sure plenty of things I'm leaving off. We've got some design services, some sort of more straight-up training and consulting things, and then we have some products for which we are the whole tech team, and we sort of own that through our managed services business or through some startup sort of services. But yeah, I think in my view, our historical wheelhouse has been kind of in kind of growth stage startups that are wanting to move fast. Like they found some product market fit, they've got funding, and we're kind of helping to join those teams and help either level up their developers to some extent or keep their code maintainable over time and get some more security in terms of testing and other things.
You often, as a team, find yourself collaborating with internal developers within those clients' organizations?
Yeah, very often.
So what are some ways that your team is able to, maybe if there's developers out there that are, whether they're freelancers or maybe find themselves in a similar type of environment, what do you think are some good attributes of being a guest in someone else's code base?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So I think, and I like your terminology too, like you are the guest in somebody else's code base. And this is true even, for people joining new teams, right? Like you join a new team, you get hired in a new job. Hopefully on day 2 of the job, you're not making big proclamations about how everything sucks in this one area of the code base. You're doing more listening than talking. You're understanding the environment under which that code was created. You don't have to understand all of it, of course, but like having some empathy for both the folks on your team and for the prior developers in the code base. I think it's really easy for me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of other folks, to fall into the trap of saying, this isn't how I would do something. This is bad. I would really recommend y'all move to some other technology or do some different design pattern or what have you. But I think taking that time to sort of step back and really understand the problem space is super important, is kind of our first step. And then I think I've sort of tackled 2 different directions here in terms of like once I understand what I think should happen, I've gone a couple different directions and they've worked to varying degrees. One is what's hurting the worst, what is the place that I can make the most impact, where people, what files are being changed the most and taking the longest for people to work through. And it's a thing Michael Feathers talks about a lot that I think is really powerful. Basic kind of Git history mining stuff. And in using those insights or whatever, any other insights about what's going to be the most impactful to kind of inform proposals to your teammates and your boss and whoever else. So I think that can work really well if it's framed right. I think it can also be really interesting for this other idea of like, maybe you shouldn't tackle the biggest, gnarliest thing that hurts the worst, but maybe you should start off more by kind of building trust and grabbing the easiest thing that's going to improve things somewhat, just so you can start to build trust with your teammates and really get them bought into the idea of improving stuff for whatever definition of improve you're using. Everybody's got their own insights and unique experiences that inform like what better means to them. But if you can find some alignment on wherever that you feel like that easiest thing is to improve the state of things, I think that can be a really like great first win for the team and really set you up for success in terms of more of those wins.
I think you make a really good point about how when you come into that scenario of being, try not to take on those bigger projects or those bigger tasks first, maybe like the big gnarly thing as an example, because I think one of the things that's really can be challenging if depending on how large of a task that thing might be. Let's say the difference between like working on a 1 or 2 week project versus something you can do in a day or two, you get a feedback cycle, whereas there's always that kind of like when anyone new is part of a team and you don't have, I mean, we've all probably, I'm sure you've experienced this, that like someone's working on something, you don't really know how long it's going to take, and you're kind of curious how they're getting along with it, the whole process, and like what's the output going to be, and like you're this kind of mystery person, whether you're a new person and within a development team, client services, or actually you're a new employee somewhere. Just like the sooner you can kind of like, I think for your own well-being as well, to test that you can actually go through the process and show that you say, write your code, make your changes, do a pull request, go through the process, get it closed, go through the feedback process and see how the process all works. Then you can take that step on, because otherwise if there's misalignment and expectations there about what the process looks like, oh, you spent 2 weeks, like I could have, it's just like you didn't understand some of the process, so you didn't get the right, whatever that team's processes are, if you're not aligning really well with it, I think that just you're delaying getting feedback on that. And then you're like, people might be going, well, what did you spend the last 2 weeks doing or whatever? And like, it's hard to get that kind of confidence. We do the same thing with when we take over software projects. That's what we kind of focus on, is taking over existing projects and working on them. And it's like, our clients always want us to work on these big new things, like, because they're like, hey, we need to get this big thing that's in our backlog done. We've been promising our customers. And we're like, that's great, but we need to start over here on some really small things, not because we just want to knock down some low-hanging fruit or something like that. It's more of we actually want to prove to you that we can collectively work together. You put in a request, we make sure that we understand it, we turn it around, we deploy to staging, we push it to production, we go through the QA process with you or whatever, or get their acceptance on it, show that we can deploy it into their environment and get them to close it off. Like, we've not only proven that we can collaborate on that something took a half a day, but we actually have access to all the right tools. And if something were to unexpectedly happen, we can jump in and switch over. But if you're working on a big thing and something pops up, there's always an expectation of like, well, can't you just jump over to this? Because that also happens, things change. And if you're just working on that one big thing, they're like, there's no proof that you can actually like solve a problem together yet. So I think the sooner you can, as a developer, show that you can go through that process, you can build some confidence there and then take it on to bigger things. So I think, you make a good point there about that.
Absolutely. And it's also like harder to build trust to get the buy-in to do those big things anyway. And then even if it is a success at the end, it's like, have you already lost people like a week and a half into your work?
Let's talk a little bit about coding a little bit more specifically. What's your take on monoliths versus microservices?
Okay. Yeah, this is one that's near and dear to my heart. Let me set this up by saying I think there are a lot of benefits to microservices and services architectures in general, just in terms of pulling things apart and having smaller teams be able to collaborate on a small thing and do exactly what you're talking about, like be able to do the thing and as a team of 5 or whatever and ship it. And I've worked on pretty big monoliths where we saw a lot of pain of people trying to integrate, running into each other. The test suite was huge, flaky, super slow, painful to upgrade dependencies, libraries, stuff like that. I'm prefacing all this You can probably sense what's coming with some caveats that I do understand the benefits of microservices just in terms of like independent deployability, scale, fault tolerance, small team ownership. We have some clients come to us wanting to fix their legacy code issues and their legacy code tech debt, bad stuff in general, by moving to microservices from their monolith. In a lot of cases, my observation has been that folks are not thinking hard enough about the costs of that decision. And there's plenty of costs that folks understand, like latency. I think folks pretty much agree, you make a network call, it's a little slower. You might need some more infrastructure. And people basically understand those and are ready to pay those costs when they come talk to us. I think we do underestimate often as developers and as people who are out there listening to the Googles and Amazons and Netflixes and whoever's of the world that this is just the way every software product should go. We should all be using Kubernetes and Kafka and everything else. There's a lot of downsides that I think people are not thinking through completely, or if they are thinking through the downsides and how to mitigate them, they're not necessarily like thinking through what those mitigations are going to cost. So like things like data consistency and how are you going to design around eventual consistency or where the sources of truth and derived data live and back-end sync processes and like who owns ETL to some business intelligence system. Designing data-intensive applications is a real good eye-opener to like how complicated these things can get, even in just a React, Rails, Postgres sort of dead simple app. And in fact, take React out of that, make it just a server thing with just static web access. And I could go on and on about the costs. I've got a talk I gave it a couple years ago, I think, maybe last year, about the costs, because I think there's a lot of them. And I think folks in general underestimate how many things they're going to need to think through and pay for, and how big the folks who are out there giving talks about, singing the praises of these kinds of architectures, how much bigger those companies are and how much more they're budgeting. And I talked earlier about like thinking about some technical spend within your iteration or within your prioritization stuff. That operational cost, that overhead rises, in my experience, a lot when you move to a microservices architecture. But I prefaced all that by saying I do understand the costs, and often they're worth it. We have a lot of clients for whom they're totally worth it. They have enough developers that it would be crazy for them to try and stick everything in one application. They could probably do it, right? But there's costs in that case as well. So my default is always to start with a monolith if I've got any say in it, which hopefully I usually do. And then as absolutely necessary and in a very principled way, I try and extract services, hopefully, if it's possible, modularizing in the process. I'll give you an example from, I think just yesterday or 2 days ago, I proposed splitting out a service for this very small startup app, which I wouldn't ordinarily do, but it's necessary in this case. It's an Elixir backend. There's some digital signature PDF stuff we're going to have to do, and we're going to need some other thing that it may exist, but I haven't found something that's super mature in terms of PDF digital signatures on the Erlang virtual machine. So we're probably going to spin up a JVM service for that, and it'll be small and might even be the sort of thing where we shell out to a command or something, but it'll definitely be like a separate process. So I see a lot of downsides to microservices, and I don't want to be a hater, and I don't want to like discount people's experiences who have had a great time with them. But I think for a lot of folks who are considering them, I would just like them to think through the costs in a more principled way than a lot of folks do by default.
In my experience, like I've seen advantages to going down the microservices path, but I think you made a good point about how that a lot of those times those projects or those companies and organizations have a bit more budget, have a bit more capacity to do that kind of a little bit more thoroughly. Because we've also seen a lot of projects where how does premature optimization fit into this conversation in a way? And I think, like we've talked about, like the fault tolerance aspect to microservices. We've seen projects that are built with Ruby on Rails and have separate repository for the React front end. They're completely coupled together that if they're not deployed at the same time to make changes, like it's like a monolith, but it's not. You have two things to deploy in parallel because you haven't handled any of the fault tolerance stuff, and now every change is requiring you to make changes in two different repositories. Like there's a project we inherited that has that problem, and we're just like, this is kind of ridiculous that we have to come up with a better way to handle that. And it's interesting to see that was nice that they built it this way, I suppose, but it's actually creating a lot of extra work that just feels completely unnecessary, especially given, our experience with Ruby on Rails over the years. Like what advantage are we getting out of this thing? It's like, I think, and sometimes I think I've touched on it on a couple of other episodes recently. Sometimes one of that's scratching developers' itches more than like their curiosity about trying something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a cost to a long-term cost to each of the decisions you're making as a software developer that you may not have to necessarily pay yourself outside of maybe having to do the work. But if you leave that project at some point, or that business, or whether you're a freelancer or working at an agency, those decisions have long-term costs for those clients. And I don't think they're always more about like, how am I going to approach this? Now, how is the company going to be responsible and on the hook for this, for whatever decisions I made right now? So that was the topical thing at that point in time. So I don't want to like discourage people necessarily from experimenting with new things, but sometimes you're doing that on someone else's dime, and then someone else maybe like us has to come in and pick it up and figure out how we're going to do it. And it slows us down, and we're not able to do things as quickly as we like. And that's expensive for us. And that means that it's expensive for our clients. And we're not necessarily upset with you as a previous developer that did that. It's just, we've learned from that. So do you often find yourself more on the side of team refactor or team rewrite?
Almost always. I default to refactor always, to a fault. I know, like in my heart of hearts, that rewrite is often the right choice, particularly, I think, for those cases where the scope is flexible and where you can really reimagine what the product needs to do. I think for those cases where it really the product needs to have all of the same capabilities as it did before, we just need to improve it. Maybe improve it in some drastic way, but it has to have at least a baseline of wherever we started. I think for those cases where the words feature parity ever get spoken, I'm going to push really, really hard for refactoring and improving incrementally. Yeah, and in general, I tend to lean on the incremental refactoring. And really, like, this is actually back to the same conversation as earlier, right? Like, do you scratch the biggest itch? Do you fix the biggest pain point and, like, big bang, knock out this hugely impactful thing that's ultimately going to make things a lot better over time? Or do you show incremental progress and improvement and constantly make things better? And I tend to pick the incremental stuff in general. But yeah, it's always interesting when you find those cases where you've got somebody who knows the product extremely well, what it currently does, who knows their customers, and who's able to make those hard decisions to say, you know what, this use case does not matter anymore. Let's just get rid of it. That doesn't matter in the new thing. Here's this very simple functionality that we need to build. And in those cases, I think I'd be totally on board with a rewrite. And I would in a lot of other cases too. I think the choice to rewrite can be really empowering for a lot of developers. It can be fun to work on a greenfield thing. I sometimes feel a little bit paralyzed in those situations. I like to tinker and improve and get the quick feedback. But I think microservices architectures can be a great example of places where it's pretty safe to refactor, because hopefully, once you've paid down all your costs, you've hopefully got like contract tests and of all your clients are telling you what they expect, and got sort of safeguards in terms of like canary testing and all the stuff that comes before that in your deployment pipelines. And so your rewrite of what is hopefully a microservice that's along what I think Sam Newman's definition of where it's like a 2-week rewritable thing, then yeah, sure, rewrite a thing if it's going to take 2 weeks. But if it's going to take, a year, and that's your estimate, then it's probably going to take 2 years or never get finished. And so, yeah, that's the kind of situation I don't want to be in.
We'll be back with my interview with Colin in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to thank you for listening to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding conversations like this valuable, please consider sharing it amongst your peers. I'm not sure how you heard about it. Perhaps it was written in some sand or in some concrete while you're walking along a sidewalk somewhere. But whatever it is, thank you to whoever shared that in the first place with you, and I hope you can help pass on the word. Maybe consider writing a review on Apple Podcasts. Either way, thank you again for listening. And now back to our interview with Colin Jones. How does your team work with your clients when it comes to prioritizing and addressing technical debt? Like, how do you go about approaching that with your clients?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it varies a lot depending on the client. For the folks where we're the whole tech team, it's really kind of a matter of us kind of being, we are the whole tech team. So it's up to us to sort of be the experts and give the client everything they need. We can push as hard as we need to if it's something that actually has to get done, or we can sort of lay out choices and trade-offs, and it's got to be kind of in the language of the client. Whoever we're talking to, if they're going to understand increasing costs over a long term versus, a 2-week payout now to decrease the long-term cost, CapEx, OpEx, sort of, finance language, then that's the language I think we got to learn to speak as developers. But then, we've also got plenty of clients where our folks who are leading our teams at our clients are extremely technical, and we voice some concerns and say, hey, there's this race condition here that we think is going to bite us if we don't address it. And they say, okay, let's do that thing. And so, it can be as formal as a proposal document, a whole separate statement of work, and as informal as just saying, well, actually, I was going to say as informal as just having a quick conversation, but then there's even a further level, which is just, knock it out just while we're in there, rename some stuff, extract a class, etc. The small things that just not even a conversation around it, right? You just do it.
Just do it. I'm assuming that not every software developer that you hire shows up with the skill sets of a consultant. How do you go about helping them understand what that world is like? Or has that not been such a big thing to kind of focus on there?
No, it's a really good question. And I think I would even go a step further and say, many of the folks we hire, we've historically hired almost exclusively through our apprenticeship program. I joined 10 years ago as an apprentice with 2 or 3 years of Rails brochure, little 5-10 page website stuff. So yeah, even not consulting skills, but just needing to learn how to write automated tests well and how to pull concerns apart and decouple. And the reason I'm answering that way is because I think for both our answer is kind of the same, and that's valuing continual learning and growth through our apprenticeship. That's part of it, right? We expect people who come out of that to have some baseline of skills in a bunch of different areas. And some of those areas are communication sort of things and empathy and the ability to talk at the right level of abstraction with a customer. And then we have reading clubs and roundtables and professional development mentors once folks finish an apprenticeship, or if they're not doing an apprenticeship, if they're coming in as a more senior person that's doing more of a apprenticeship-like thing, but it's more of an onboarding, really. Then it's more the kind of the latter category of things that's sort of more ongoing. It's baked into our job description, so it's everybody's incentivized to be consultative and to understand those things. And we've got levels of folks involved in a project, right? From the sales and account management side, and directors who are usually more technical folks, but not necessarily, who are really helping to organize staffing and making sure folks on the ground are doing great work and our clients are really pleased. So I think a big part of it is that sort of ongoing feedback and learning from folks who are more experienced than you when you go onto a client, right? Hopefully we're not putting any of our brand new folks who don't really have any consulting experience onto a project by themselves. And, we've made mistakes in that area in the past and have learned from them. So yeah, I think in terms of the how, I think just valuing learning and having everybody incentivized to keep learning. And actually part of it is screening for that kind of thing in the hiring process too, right? Just making sure people are communicative and understand what consulting is as a business and are interested in the people side of things as well as the software side of things.
Have you noticed that, because it's been my experience, sometimes you'll talk with people through the interview process or when you're recruiting people, early on in people's careers, they really want to be able to focus on learning to be a good software developer. I think that's priority number one. And they'll take a job where they can get one so they can start practicing that skill. And then I think one of the things that I'm sharing is I've struggled with sometimes finding that bring people in and then 6 to 12 months later, they're like, maybe I'm going to be better off at a product company because there's this illusion that I can focus more on being a developer there and not necessarily working on trying to figure out how to be a consultant and a developer at the same time, as if they're two different things entirely, but there's some overlap there. But I don't know. I was just curious about some of the experiences that you've had in that capacity.
Yeah, we've definitely had people leave who were really excited about going to a product shop. Some of whom I think made good decisions, and some of whom I would have liked to coach them into a different decision. You're always going to have to convince somebody to buy into your ideas, your technical ideas that you've got. I don't think there's anything about being on an internal company team that means your ideas just get accepted whole hog. Maybe you come in as the team lead and that's your role, and so they do. That's a separate story. But I think a lot of people, I have seen in the past, at least a handful of people, have the idea that by joining a product company, they're going to have somehow the ability to influence things without having to develop the consultative people skills. But I think those skills, you need them regardless. Our business model is different than a product company. The way you convince people to make a decision is pretty similar, I think. As an outsider, you have a different perspective and voice, and you can speak to different things. And as an insider, you have presumably the longer view in mind, although we're in companies for a pretty long time often. I think there are differences, and yeah, I've seen that. I've seen folks migrate in that direction as well.
I'm not trying to be too self-serving for our audience here in terms of like trying to be an advocate for going into client services. When people have asked me, what should I do? It's my first job as a programmer. Should I go try to find a job at some startup product company or something, or a company that's well established and it's 10 years into the startup phase? Or should I go work at like a client services company? What do you recommend for me? And I'm like, well, you're going to have to get some experience one way or another. And my own experience is like, well, I learned more through the client services experience of, I got to work on a wide array of different types of projects, different situations. And I learned, it's almost like I got to be like a temporary employee at like all these different companies in a really short period of time, whereas you get to go learn how it's working at one company for a couple of years. And I'm just curious, like, do you often get asked that question from budding software developers? And what sort of response might you have to that?
I don't remember being asked that. Might have, but I have a really bad memory, Sue, so I might just be forgetting something that happened 2 weeks ago. It's hard for me to actually answer because I've never worked for a software shop that wasn't a consulting shop. I've always been in sort of an agency world, so I can't actually answer from experience. But yeah, it's interesting though when you're talking about going into a company for a year or two, and I think a lot of folks in the software world, a consultancy with a long-term product view like ours, maybe typically like on the order of 6 months, a year, or something like that is what we're looking at. And sometimes longer. I've been on a project for 2.5 years before as an individual contributor, and it was great experience, learned a ton. But it's interesting that like in the product world, people might hop jobs that often. And so they're still getting those different perspectives from different companies. But yeah, I mean, for me, I like about client services and consulting the fact that we have kind of this organizational view of all these different experiences and are able to sort of pull those together and have access to a lot of different people at any given time who are working on crazy different problems. And so like anything that comes up, we've got our shared community where we can sort of talk through things as a group with what it kind of feels like people from a lot of separate companies, and the overlap and the number of collective projects we've touched is a lot. And I don't know if it's more than any given product company, but it feels like there's that potential.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, just think about how sometimes when we're interviewing people that say 2 or 3 years into their career, they're like, okay, it's time to move around, and maybe they've been at a product company the whole time, and then we'll go through our process of interviewing with them, and on paper, it seems like they've got quite a decent level of experience. But then when you dive into some of the technical things, you realize they were kind of like, they only had so many options to learn so much, and they were kind of like working in this one area of, say, a code base. And then you start like, well, what about these other areas? Like, well, I've never touched that. I'm like, there's like a huge gap now in your knowledge skill because you've been kind of specialized in your company on one part of the business. Like I worked on APIs. And so like, I don't know anything about working on this other area of the application or anything. I've never built any features, or it can come across with its own set of challenges.
For sure. And yeah, that's definitely like one of the trade-offs I definitely see. And I guess jumping to the defense of the product companies a little bit in that, yeah, that generalist specialist trade-off is a really interesting one. We're definitely mostly in that generalist polyglot world, like which has a lot of benefits in terms of seeing how different communities do things, but it also has downsides, right? Like if I have to join a project next month that's in .NET, then suddenly I got to learn this ecosystem that I don't know very well and go in there and ramp up really quickly and hopefully bring those experiences up pretty quickly. But if I'm at a product shop or a series of product shops really focused on my specific area of the world, APIs or whatever, then I'm able to be the expert in that area, and that's potentially has a lot of leverage.
I have a couple of final questions for you. One, what do you believe are a few common traits of maintainable software?
Automated testing of some kind. Without it, it just makes my job as a maintainer so much harder. Like I don't want to have to click through the entire app and understand the entire thing in order to make a small change or even a big change. I want some sort of testing. And I don't care if tests don't give me 100% confidence. I just want some increasing level of confidence that things are working properly. So some kind of automated testing, some sort of, like production monitoring, alerting, observability, whatever you want to call that kind of world. I think that's super important because testing is going to fall down at some point, and I want to know before my users do, or at least at the same time as my users do when something's going wrong. This is less of a technical thing, but I think it's important, like collective ownership, the whole team really like feeling some responsibility for the success or failure of a piece of code or a service or whatever, and being able to like tune things up and make tweaks and fix things without, I have to go to person A and convince them that they should make this change to their thing. I want to go and be able to work with them and have it be sort of a team ownership sort of situation. Yeah, those are kind of big ones. I mean, there's lots of like in the code base kinds of, good naming and things being fairly whatever you want to call it, decoupled, decomplected, solid or modular, everybody call it Unix philosophy, right? Any of these things, people, to me, in a lot of cases, mean the same thing. I think those can be pretty important in the long term as well.
And so what book do you find yourself most often recommending to software developers?
These days, the Design Data Intensive Applications book by Martin Kleppmann might be because we're going through a book club on it right now, and one of my colleagues is going through it for the third time. So yeah, that book is really great. I still like the refactoring book, the Martin Fowler refactoring book. Actually, I haven't gone through the new edition, the JavaScript one that he just came out with, but I like so many things about that book.
I feel like the first refactoring book was recommended by someone that had offered me a job at the time back in 2004. I remember just like spending a couple of weeks just being like, oh my gosh, this is going to change everything about how I write this PHP code as I start this new job. And then when he came back from his holiday vacation, he told me that he found this other framework called Ruby on Rails and wanted to build everything in that instead. That's how I got introduced to Ruby on Rails, and I didn't get the job. It became this thing, but refactoring was like this huge, at the time, it was just like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And then I was like, I just wanted to spend time cleaning up my code, which was not something I was ever super motivated to do before. So great book. Where can people find you online?
Oh, I am TRPT Colin, pretty much every social media thing, GitHub, Twitter, whatever. Trumpet is just to head that off. So I was a trumpet player in a former life. Yeah, so they're eighthlight.com, but TRPT Colin pretty much everywhere.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you joining us on Maintainable today to talk about the joys of client services, how that relates to building maintainable software and dealing with technical debt and working with, not only hiring and grooming your developers to become good consultants, but also to have that mindset, even if you're in a product shop. I think those are all really good topics to kind of touch on today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Really appreciate it. It was a fun conversation. Thanks for having me.